Hello, I am James Cornelius. I am going to interview today here on March 29th, 2016 in the upper level of the old state capitol, Mr. Fritz Klein, who, as you see, is dressed as Abraham Lincoln. This interview is part of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library's Historians Speak Oral History Project. Good afternoon, Fritz.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cornelius.
Thank you for joining us. As we planned, we will speak to Fritz Klein as himself, out of character, it is said, for a while, and then ask him to be in character as Abraham Lincoln for a portion of this interview as well. Fritz, would you tell us a little bit about your parents' background?
Oh my. Well, my father was second generation from Holland and born in Pella, Iowa, and raised in Holland, Michigan area, and met my mother, who was third gen. No, her father was from England, so she was second generation too. And he worked on the farm that she visited in the summer. So they were eventually married right before World War II and moved to California, where I and my two sisters were born. And so that's where I was raised. And my mother was involved in acting as a young woman in, not exactly in Hollywood, but it was moving in that direction when she pulled out.
Uh-huh. Fritz is your real name, your given name?
My real name is actually Richard Frederick.
Richard Frederick.
But I think I was about a week old when they christened me with Fritz after the uncle for which I was named.
I see.
So,
do either of your sisters have a somewhat old world name also?
No, but we all had names that nobody else wanted or duplicated in our generation. None of us really liked our name when we were kids.
Okay.
Why do parents do that to children?
Because they can. So your mother was in acting. What was your father's profession?
Well, my father was a farmer, and like Lincoln, didn't wish to be a farmer. And so after the war, there were jobs aplenty for the GIs, and he went to an auto body shop and told them he knew how to do it. He didn't.
Had he been a GI?
Yes. This is after World War II.
Okay.
And so they hired him, and he just watched the other fellows and learned as he went. They knew that.
Learn as you go.
But that was his trade then, all of his life. And then when I was in high school in the 60s, well, actually before that, early 60s, my mother started a business that eventually took off so well. She was selling products worldwide, and my father left his business to manage my mother, in a narrow sense of the term.
Yes. Interesting. Well, I see just a little bit of both influences from them in your career now, perhaps.
Oh yes, they were both artistic and creative and entrepreneurial, and I got a good lick of both of them.
Do either of your sisters show evidence of inheriting those traits or skills or interests?
Actually, I had a sister who was who tried out for the Mickey Mouse Club, and she made it, but then she injured her foot and was replaced by another girl with the same name, Cheryl. And so that was her short but sweet career in acting.
Well, maybe for the best.
Yes.
Well, tell us about your growing up then, around those sisters, those ambitions.
Well, my growing up years were, as a boy, probably ideal in one sense. I did have a lot of allergies as a boy, so because of them, they took me to Arizona. My parents pulled up stakes for my sake and moved to Arizona, which cured me, and largely. And I loved those years. I would have stayed there all my life. I just love the Southwest still. And but then my parents had some financial difficulties and went back to California to recover. And by that time, I was fine. And so I did my high school there, and then I studied to be a Lutheran minister. And so I left home at the tender age of 17, not realizing I'd never go back. And but I worked my way through college and spent every spare moment laboring to pay my tuition. And I had an antique car that I sold, and I used to repair player pianos, and I sold that, and I sold everything of value in my life to pay for my college. So
had there been a person in the clergy or otherwise who influenced your thoughts about becoming a minister? Or in
true
your family?
confessions. I spent so many days skipping school to go skiing when I was in high school that they informed me that I probably
What kind of skiing?
Snow skiing.
Downhill.
Yeah, downhill skiing in Southern California. My
Are
job.
you pulling my leg?
No, I'm not. It's a wonder I didn't pull mine. But my job in the summers in high school was as a lifeguard, and almost all of my peers were older than I.
Yes.
And so they could go, and I just ran with these people. We all drove antique cars and ran around together. So they would say, "Can you come with us?" And I would ditch school and go. Well, the long story short, when the school informed me that I probably wouldn't graduate, I got on my knees and I said, "Oh God, please, if you let me graduate, I'll give my life to you." And that meant become a minister, right? They're the only people serious about this stuff. So that's the true confession there.
Good to your word, I guess.
And I graduated.
Where does one go snow skiing in Southern California?
Oh, we went to Mount Baldy.
Which is how far from
where we
you live?
lived? That was about an hour's drive.
I am better educated now. I had no idea. Okay. And
Yes.
what college did you attend in that?
I went to several. The Lutheran schools that I attended. The first one was St. John's College in Winfield, Kansas. Then from there I went to California Concordia College in Oakland. And from there I went to Concordia Senior College in Fort Wayne, Indiana. All of those schools are now defunct. I don't think that has anything to do with me, but the church was going through some transition, and some of their different schools shifted and what they did. But then I ended up in St. Louis at the seminary, and that's where I met my wife. And I left the seminary and the pastoral business and started a new career in landscaping.
Interesting. So would you say there was a person in any of that training there in those different schools or colleges who most inspired you, either at the time or for a future career?
I had one professor that encouraged me to never. I had to learn several foreign languages, and he was sort of a favorite and encouraged me to never let that language go, which I haven't. But that's the only particular individual that I can think of.
Was that German or what language?
Actually, it was Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
What was that?
But I had to learn
gentleman's-
German and Hebrew and Latin and Greek, and I
Uh-huh.
had years of all of them. So.
Yeah. And what was that gentleman's name?
John Rybar.
John Rybar.
Yeah.
Did
And he and his wife would have me at their home at Christmas because I worked Christmas Day, Christmas Eve. I just worked all through college.
Yeah.
And I think they had pity on me. I lived in a dorm by myself, and
Did he live long enough to see you in your Lincoln
I looked
career?
him up recently,
No.
and he's passed away.
Oh.
Yeah.
Too bad.
Yeah, he was a Ugaritic scholar, which is a precursor to some of the old Semitic languages.
Yes, interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have occasion ever to use your Hebrew knowledge now?
Oh, daily, yeah.
Daily.
Yeah.
Okay. Glad to hear it.
So,
Encouraging.
yeah.
Well, tell us then if you had a particular interest in history distinct from what you would obviously encounter in seminary training with the Lutheran Church. Was there anything else about American history or political history that caught your eye at a certain stage?
Well, in high school, I think I mentioned briefly that I ran with these kids and I had an antique car.
Mm-hmm.
And I developed an interest in antiques and began collecting them in high school. And that led to an interest in early American history, not specifically Lincoln, but just the whole 19th century era, late 19th century westward expansion. And that combined well with my growing up years in the Southwest. And
when it was being settled, organized into territories, is that the connection?
Yes, yeah. And some of our family history, my mother grew up in the Southwest when there were still cowboys out on the open range, and we had a number of family stories that just fit in all very nicely with that whole period, although they were much later than the 19th century. So it all came together nicely.
Well, what became of your landscaping work? How many years did you pursue that?
Well, when I left the seminary, I found employment at Missouri Botanical Garden and sort of did my training there, and then had an opportunity to do landscaping in Hawaii. And my wife, to be at the time, was a school teacher, and there was an opportunity for her as well. And because of certain circumstances, it was best for us to marry there, and so we did. And so I did that work there, and then acting was something of a hobby. I had we had a pageant that we did every year in Old Hawaii and things like that. Now those two things have reversed. And so I have a small orchard, and my yard is only about a half acre, but it looks like a botanical garden.
Here at the latitude of Springfield.
Yes, yes.
Very good, very good. Well, backing up just a little bit, you met your wife while you were in the seminary in St. Louis, you mentioned.
It was after I left the seminary.
After that.
Yeah, and then we met and began to date and so forth. And when we engaged, we discovered that for a number of reasons, it would probably be good if we married out of town.
Mm-hmm. Was she aware of your variety of interests? You hadn't, and skills, and she must have known.
She led a rather sheltered life, so marrying me was a little bit like hitching to a wild horse.
All right. Well, we'll save that for another day, if any. Yes. Is it all a pleasant memory for your family to have been in Hawaii for?
Oh, yes.
For how many years?
We were there 5 years. Our oldest, who's now nearly 40, was born there, and that's where, of course, all of this Lincoln stuff began.
Yeah.
And then he has a few memories of it, but we still relate to some of our old friends from Hawaii.
Well,
yeah. So.
What profession did your wife pursue in those years?
Teaching until the childbearing years came, and then we homeschooled our children until they were in high school. And
very early in that movement.
Oh, we were, yeah. We were pioneers, I guess. And we hardly knew anybody else that was doing it at the time that we began. But and now she teaches. She had a minor in music, and now she teaches piano, and she works at the Steinway place out there at the Gables, and teaches piano in our home, and so she loves it.
Well, good. And you have more than one child?
We have 4 children,
You
yeah.
have 4.
3 girls and a boy.
Tell us their names and professions now, please.
Jacob is the oldest, and he was the one that was born in Hawaii, and he is a doctor of ancient philosophy out at Colgate University. And then our second, Leah, is I'm not really sure what her job title is. She works at Seattle Genetics in she was in research, but now she's in management, and she's at a bit of transition right now, moving in within that company, Seattle Genetics. And then our third child is Esther, and she is an RN here in Springfield, and she and her husband have a child. We have 2 grandchildren, and then our youngest, Grace, has recently been accepted by a university out in Colorado. She postponed the university about 10 years, and so she's nearly 30. But so then after she finishes her undergrad, she wants to go into project management and work with overseas orphans. She spent several months in Africa and fell in love with that kind of benevolent work. So
very interesting. Well, they seem to take after their parents in many respects, just as you did from your parents.
Oh, they've all gone.
But I see
and they've all done very
combinations.
well. They've all done very well.
I see combinations, certainly in their names.
Yes.
Yeah, 3 Olds and a New Testament. There. Very nice. Fritz, let's go on to, I guess, what we consider your later education as you became more proficient in the Lincoln presentation field.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, initially, of course, I didn't dream that I'd be in my 40th year right today. But between 1976 and 2016, I thought one long weekend would be it. And so I learned a 10-minute script. The initial idea was to take the script that was edited out of Lincoln's own words, that they use at Disneyland, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln.
Yeah.
And now it's Disney World. But they claim proprietary rights to that particular edition of Lincoln's works, and most of it comes from his Young Men's Lyceum speech.
Yeah.
So I ended up with a commitment to do this and no script. So I started studying Lincoln's words and put together a 10-minute script of my own. And I'd never done that kind of work before. So it was new, but it was very gratifying. I found people that were responding in a way that was very unexpected, emotionally, sensationally, in the sense that there was connection with me. And the folk in Hawaii were demographically different in the sense that Asian and Pacific Basin peoples largely, as well as some native Hawaiians, aren't that many. But and they don't relate well largely to Western culture, but they related very well to Lincoln. And I was struck by that because I didn't expect that. And I was struck by the power that the visage and words of Lincoln carried with these people that seemed unlikely to me. You know, a Midwest audience maybe, but not a Pacific and Asian audience.
How do you explain this? What was their foreknowledge of Lincoln that, or I'm sure it's the quality of your presentation in part, but how do you explain this?
Well, I'm not so sure it was the quality in the beginning, but I was so nervous about this whole procedure, I mimed the words. I pre-recorded everything.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and so I think most of my audiences in the early days were trying to figure out if I was really speaking or lip syncing.
Right now, you're really
I don't do that
speaking.
anymore. Right now, I'm
Yeah.
not lip syncing. But so whatever the case, it's still a bit of a mystery.
Well, what exactly were you saying? It was his own words. Was it from early in his life, or was it his presidency? What connected with people from a essentially non-Western culture?
It expressed concern for the state of the nation and a need for prayer. In his presidency, now I worked for a religious organization, you understand, so there were 8, maybe 9, if you count his last one that was never published, religious proclamations that Lincoln gave. So some of this was edited together from those. And some of it was just general statements about the nation, such as he gave in the Young Men's Lyceum speech. So, but there was love of country. And that was unexpected.
Yes.
If you know much about the history of Hawaii, you would know why, I suppose. So nonetheless, that gave me pause to reflect, but I didn't expect it to continue. But there was some quality because I was asked to do encore performances, and somebody saw one of those encore performances. It was still the same little 10-minute script, and said, would I consider putting together a full 1-hour presentation script and then auditioning for a summer theater in California in 1979. That was very intimidating. So I went through the only book in our library in Kealakekua, Hawaii, on Lincoln, the Benjamin P. Thomas book, which is still one of my favorites. Of all the books to pick, that was a good one. You still see that in libraries and places like this, everywhere. So, and I still like Thomas. But I read that thing over and over and over, and then I tackled Lincoln's collected works. They were there too. And I was overwhelmed, but I took very careful notes of everything that I thought could be used in a script, and photocopied reams of stuff. And I put together a production that essentially talked about his life and philosophy. And when I was auditioned, they accepted me, and I spent my summer of 1979 in Solvang, California.
What was that town?
Solvang is a Danish town in the southern central California area, close to Santa Maria, very close to the Reagan Ranch, actually.
Okay.
And so we had windmills and Danish pastry and Abe Lincoln all thrown together in that little village, and scads of tourists. And so it was a fun gig.
Yeah.
They'd come in munching these, but nonetheless, I cut my teeth the hard way in theater, doing it all myself. I did in Hawaii, before I took that step, I met, I don't know, some of the folks who are a little farther along in life may remember the Galloping Gourmet from TV fame in the 1970s and 80s, Graham Kerr. Well, they were friends of ours, he and his wife Trina, and she sort of trained me in their living room in acting. And so I spent many afternoons in their home performing in front of Graham and Trina, and getting my, it wasn't all self-taught, but, and I still recall some of the things that she taught me and used them, but
interesting.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a lot of fun. But then in 1979, somebody walked into there, and just to let you know, occasionally I would perform for an audience of one person. So I wasn't the great...
Not by choice.
Not by choice. It wasn't the great, hit that I was hoping for. But one of those individuals asked me if I would consider being a part of a tour, kind of an Up With People, Get Out the Vote tour that they were going to take across the country in early 1980 because of the elections in late 1980.
Yes.
And there was sort of a national malaise in those years. That was at the end of the Carter years. And they wanted to stir up interest in getting folks out to vote. So it was nonpartisan and sort of a musical thing. and then I put together a special program for that about using Lincoln's words again about the importance of voting. And I would just do little vignettes. And I remember one time I was in Chattanooga in a theater, up in a theater box, thinking, I'm in the Deep South sitting in a theater box. Is this crazy or what?
Yes,
Since then I found that most folks in the South are not the same as they used to be, but nonetheless, it was fun. But from that tour, which went from the West Coast to Washington, I traveled with my young family by that time. I received a drawer full of invitations from all over the country. Please come speak here, come speak here. We've got a school, we've got this conference, what have you. Could you, would you? And so we went back to Hawaii thinking, well, number one, we didn't really want to put our child in Hawaiian schools, and he was ready to start. And it's not fun being in the minority, and white boys were there. So we didn't really want to stay there and raise our children there, and this was a good opportunity to try something new.
Yes.
So we did.
Well, this is a fascinating combination of time periods you allude to. 1976 was your your premiere performance in the year of the nation's bicentennial.
Yes.
And then, as you say, a period of malaise to some extent economically or country's mood because of the Watergate and Vietnam eras.
Yes.
But then you move into 1980 with a fresh election.
Oh, yes.
And
this surge of patriotism.
Yes,
It was
I guess having
wonderful
to do
time to be an American.
A variety of reasons. That's a remarkable historical spot for you to have been in and capitalized. You must have recognized that, well, you couldn't have recognized it at the time, really.
No,
except
but
for the
we knew that there was a new wave of patriotism that we were riding. Yes, after the 1980 elections and bringing home the hostages, and it was, the song, the Yellow Ribbon song was being played everywhere because of the rescue of the hostages and Entebbe, and there were just so many wonderful things going on in the world at the time, and so we were kind of riding that wave. But we settled in initially in California, and then felt like we left Hawaii in 1980 and thought we needed to get a little more central. And the corporation that we worked for had an office in Texas, so we were essentially on leave, but we went there, and I started moving out, answering invitations from that point, but also visiting all of the Lincoln sites around the country. I had an invitation to live in Washington, and
Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I could have easily got set up there, but I grew up in Southern California. I really didn't want to live in a big metropolis. And it's interesting too, even though there's a lot there on Lincoln, there's a lot there on a lot of other things too. So there's more Lincoln activity in Springfield, Illinois. I don't know per capita or just per se, but there certainly is more here than in Washington. And I've done a lot of Lincoln events in Washington since, but I'm happy I settled in Springfield, Illinois.
Well, Hawaii has one Lincoln site of a sort that I'm aware of. Ewa, is that how one pronounces it?
I'm not even aware of it.
E-W-A?
Oh, Ewa, yeah, that would be Ewa.
There's a Lincoln statue of an unusual sort there, but I'm not positive when it went up. I thought, I'll look into this. No matter.
But Lincoln corresponded with King Kamehameha.
Yes.
And so that was an interesting...
that may be the reason that sculpture is there.
It could well be.
But then Southern California as a place of interest for Lincoln, or interest in Lincoln.
There's my sister lives near Redlands, and there's a lovely little museum there, and there's several out there in the LA area.
But a lot of competition from other entertainment and...
Yeah.
Well, Okay, thank you for all that. Very interesting how unexpected a career
Oh my, yeah.
can begin
Yeah.
and continue
Yeah.
in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go on then about how you, what?
Began learning about Lincoln?
Well, you've addressed that. Having the collected works present
Mm-hmm.
in Hawaii,
Mhm.
where you were living at the time, that's of material importance, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
But what did you make of, did you feel the patriotic boom, sort of, and I guess that's connected to historical interest after 1980, and did you work that into, in some respects, your presentation?
Well, there were several elements. Lincoln can be pretty dry if you just
Mhm.
read Lincoln pure, you
Mhm.
know, and I rarely deliver Lincoln's material, works, or letters, and so forth, in their original format, because the modern attention span, variety of interests, I have to make it relevant. So that was one of the first things I discovered, is that not everybody is interested in things like habeas corpus or even the Civil War, as momentous as that was.
Mhm.
But my initial journey into scholarliness, I suppose, for lack of a better word, was in the realm of children's programs, because I would give this generic theater program, and folks would say, "Oh, would you please," and that was based on his words. But then they would say, "Oh, could you please stay the night and come to my kid's school tomorrow?"
Mm.
And this happened so often. And they would say, "Oh, the children won't care what you say." Well, I cared. And so I began to study Lewis Warren's works. I got a hold of them and researched Lincoln's childhood. And I discovered that children relate to the childhood stories of Lincoln very well. The wild bear hunt, Didst Ever See his poem, and things like this, you know. And so I started establishing rapport with children, and both with Lincoln's childhood and the childhood of his children. And I discovered that was a connection that was very strong. And children, even in preschool, knew who Lincoln was. That surprised me. But so that was the first arena that I actually began to research thoroughly, and was the childhood years. And I expanded from Warren, but it was a good starting point. And and then the second area that started to appear on the horizon was the possibility of Civil War reenactments. I didn't even know there were such things. So now I'm transitioning from an actor in theaters to a presenter in schools to a impression, as they call it, in reenactment. And that became a whole arena of study, the varying battles, their place in Lincoln's presidency, in the war, in the context. It was overwhelming to me.
Yeah.
And so, but typically an event would feature a single battle, and I could learn that, and then I didn't always master them well, but enough for that weekend.
Well, you need a 1 or 2 or 3 day impression of Lincoln's understanding of it, and not the succession of all those battles.
Exactly, and I soon realized that the ins and outs of what happened on battlefields often were probably not known to Lincoln.
True.
And so I would give his perspective, and fortunately that was usually more generic, gathered from generals or other sorts of information sources that Lincoln used. So, but it became then the next arena of study for me. And as the years went by, new arenas kept opening up. So.
This is not exactly where we are in the conversation, but you make me wonder about one thing. Battle of Fredericksburg.
Yes.
In December 1862, there is supposedly a famous response he has to it when he hears of the loss of 13,000 men or so very quickly. And he says, my God, what will the people say? What will the country say?
Yes.
And he's in despair.
Yes.
He's in terrible despair.
Yes.
This sounds like an effective schoolroom presentation for that battle or any other. The problem is that the source of that is a little dubious, a little enhanced.
Exactly.
And that's something we'll talk about more later. But
well, let me address
children
that quickly.
Children would understand despair.
They would understand despair. But I quickly learned that in the if I'm going to impart something like maybe that comment and that scenario and the pathos and the despair and so forth, the pump needs to be primed, for lack of a better analogy. I one time walked into a Rotarian meeting. I probably shouldn't have mentioned who it was. And maybe it wasn't Rotarian, but it was a service club of one kind or another. And they asked me to give the Gettysburg Address. So I stepped in to the room, to their complete surprise, and began the Gettysburg Address. And their response was laughter. And I discovered something, and that is you gotta prime the pump. And I have never since then done the Gettysburg Address cold turkey, because I think what they were doing was thinking in their mind, yes, follow the bouncing ball,
Right,
bowl,
yeah.
score,
It's like
7, you know.
Watching
it was
the dog jump
expected,
through the hoop
exactly.
because they've asked for it.
And
Yeah.
they didn't expect it to be good, I don't think.
No.
But because it was so expected, and I hadn't set a mood of serious
Yes.
historicity.
Yeah, it's
They
a
weren't-
it's a funeral sermon.
Yeah, yeah. And so I have never done it since then in that
my.
manner. And I do it rarely anyway, but I try to prepare people, including children.
Yes.
So I will, if I'm going to move up to that scenario, or any kind of scenario like that, say the death of Willie, or something that would grip children, I try to talk about other things that gives them the sense that, oh my, this was a frightening time. And my wife recently sat in a children's program with me, and she says, I know you couldn't hear this, but these little boys they kept saying, oh my, really? Oh gosh, that sounds scary. Oh, and they kept perking up more, and you bring them to a point where then they can appreciate the dramatic release, or so there's a lot of dynamics, theatrical and interpersonal and so forth, that go into something like that. Just that imparting that sense of despair has to come in the right context and at the right time in the presentation, or it's lost to the audience.
So it is like picking up a book. You can't just turn to the middle of it and understand what you're reading. It is a performance. It is a
There's an art of storytelling that goes into it.
Yeah. Well, that must have been a forgettable day, whichever service club that was who laughed at the Gettysburg
I've had many
Address.
forgettable days, Doctor.
We'll touch on those later on too, I guess.
That's how we learn.
Okay, Fritz, take us from the point at which you were principally speaking to and teaching children to older audiences. What did you...
Well, I was still doing older audiences with my generic program.
Yes.
I had been also early on asked to come and present at an Amway conference, and that was the kind of a free enterprise, self-made man theme, which I developed a whole. So I had several scripts by this time that I could combine, but they were all exclusively Lincoln's words, which didn't work with kids well. And so so I was doing those in the background, but moving into a more interpretive field, for instance, in the Civil War reenactment venue, you'll have some people who have been involved in reenacting very seriously and understand a lot of strategic and tactical things that are historically accurate. They may not necessarily understand, they may approach Lincoln from one of many varied viewpoints. Then you've got their kids. And then you have the stray visitor who doesn't know anything about the Civil War, and they're all in the audience. And so how do you approach that? It was challenging, and I learned quickly that they're not all going to be Civil War historians, but you neither can you address only the lowest common denominator and treat everybody as if they know nothing. So you have to do a little of both. And occasionally I'll have to define a term. If I'm using antique language, I'll do that regularly anyway.
Yes.
So that I still have a feel for historicity, but I'm intelligible as well.
What's an example of antique language? What about malice? With malice toward none?
Oh goodness, there's many words more than one syllable that are lost to the modern high schooler these days.
No, I know that. But, is the one that surprised you most of all when you
I'm trying to
didn't realize they didn't
okay,
know it?
I mentioned something to one of the camera crew today, Lincoln's use of the word salubrious. He talked about the climate of Illinois. Salubrious, I had to look up myself. I don't use it very often.
No.
But if I do, for the sake of sounding historical,
Yeah.
I will immediately say, healthful.
Oh,
And they get it. You know?
okay. Yes, that's true. He is on the cusp of the modern language, but some of it's no longer modern or current.
Yeah, and there are a few words that were simply used differently. For instance, cool.
Oh, yeah.
Lincoln used the word cool, but he didn't mean quite what we mean.
Right.
He meant cool, calm, and collected, not socially acceptable, a person that had mastered their temper and so forth. But
That was rather cool.
yes,
Yeah.
cool of him, meaning maybe dispassionate or but nonetheless. So I like to throw words like that in occasionally, and you'll see them look at one another, and then they realize, oh, it didn't mean quite the same thing then. So yeah.
I think gay comes up in
Gay is another one.
his vocabulary now
yeah.
and then. And there are several,
Yeah.
which is educational in its own
It
right,
is, it
without
is.
being too overwhelming.
Right. Right.
It's nowhere near Shakespeare, and it's not
Oh,
even
gosh, no.
George Washington.
No,
It's
no.
it's much more modern.
Much
than
more
that.
modern. Yeah.
In that sense, at least for now, it seems to me, Lincoln is what, 95%, 98% of his vocabulary is still as we understand it today. Maybe is that too much?
I would
Too
guess
high a
that's a
number?
little high. I would say you could probably safely say 90% of his vocabulary, depending on who you're speaking to. If you're speaking to a general audience, yeah. But if you're speaking to, say, a junior high group or a high school group or even a college group, I have to be careful. Can't use his own vocabulary.
Yeah.
I discovered in high schools, as much as I tried, I failed repeatedly in high schools until I discovered a format where I come out dressed like, I'm essentially doing what I'm doing now. I'm dressed like Lincoln, but I introduce myself as Fritz Klein, and I tell them I'm an actor. That always gets their attention. And I explain what I have done and why I think Lincoln's important. I tell the story of why I think Lincoln's important, which is essentially biographical, and I give them 4 vignettes. They're not too long, but they're like the Springfield Farewell, a bit of his first inaugural Gettysburg Address, and maybe a bit of the second inaugural. But they are quiet as mice. They love it that way. It just works very well. But I don't give them too much of that period stuff. Then during the Q&A, which I try to encourage all through the program, sometimes they'll say, I I didn't understand that part in the first inaugural, or what does he mean the house divided against itself cannot stand?
Yeah.
And I'll say, well, that's a quotation from the Bible, or what have you. And but it's a good interactive format where I haven't gone too far into the Lincoln vocabulary without giving him a chance to say, wait, I don't get that. And so it works well.
Yeah. When I said 95% of his words, and you corrected me down to about 90%.
Well, just a guess.
But that's straight definitional. Of course, it's the allusions and the contexts. Everyone knows all those words. In a house divided against itself cannot stand. They don't know what it's a quotation from.
Or why.
Or why.
Why would he say that?
Why would you quote the Bible when you're running for Senate?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, all these things having to do with your preparation and then your experience are interesting. If you had, let's go a little deeper into your preparation then.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned reading Ben Thomas's book early on, and then Lincoln's collected works.
Mm-hmm.
What next? You were reading children's books, I suppose, about Lincoln's childhood, or did you not read children's books?
I discovered there are a lot of children's books that are, well, not only children's books. My next venture was Carl Sandburg, and I discovered rather quickly that Sandburg's genius was to come, from my perspective, from what I garnered, was he combined a lot of lore with a lot of history, and the two were wedded in the prairie years and the war years, and they've not hardly ever been divorced or separated since.
Not like pulling the raisins out of the oatmeal cookie. No, it's all mushed in.
Yeah, it's all mushed together. And so I left off with that. I just thought, no, wait a minute, I'm going to get myself way too confused if I go very far in that. There was a 1-volume. So not only was I reading works like Sandburg, but I was reading critiques of those works to discover whether or not it was really worth investing my time in. Because I wanted to read the good stuff and the reliable stuff. And there was I can't remember who the editors were. It was a man and wife team. A man and woman team. I don't know if they were married.
Don Fehrenbacher and Virginia Fehrenbacher.
Yeah. Oh, okay, they were. They had that might be
the recollected words of Abraham Lincoln.
Well, no, they made a 1-volume edition of Sandburg. And I can't remember. I didn't think they had the same last name, but I think it was an attempt to cull the lore from the history. Yeah. And so I ended up with that one, and that was my next one. But I had the 8-volume Sandburg, whatever it was, set,
6, yeah.
and I do 6, yeah, and including the index and the new editions and so on. But I still have them, but I rarely use them anymore.
What else did you then use? So I just want to be clear about this. You tried to avoid children's books per se, even when you were mostly talking to children's groups.
Yes, because some of the children's books would incorporate fanciful things, talking squirrels, and all sorts of imaginary things that I didn't want to get into the mix.
Okay. So what did you read then, besides? I mean, you're talking about some huge works here. But
yeah, we're going back some huge numbers of years too. I'm trying to think of one of the next. I really stayed in his collected works for some time, and I think the next major biography that I picked up was the David Donald one, and
in 1995. Is when it was published, but maybe
good
some
for you.
Point short after.
I don't know if there was
that.
anything back in the 80s.
Did you look at the Stephen Oates?
Oh yes, I did.
Stephen
Oates was one that I went through.
Right when you started, in fact.
Yeah. And then there was another one, and he fell into, he was accused of plagiarism, and I don't remember.
Well, Oates was accused
Maybe
of
that was
plagiarism.
Oates, yeah. So I've got a number of them. In those days, there weren't that many books on my shelf, but
No, but that's the oddity of it. You came along during a fairly dry or quiet spell in Lincoln publishing,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's neither here nor there.
yeah.
But by 1995,
Yeah.
there was an awful lot more, partly thanks to David Herbert Donald's
Yes,
book.
yes, and that book I really enjoyed, although I thought he was a little heavy on his on the Calvinistic. He seemed to bring that theme up, and all the fatal. He seemed to be convinced that Lincoln's fatalism was more than I perceived in my humble research. But I don't know that I've ever read anybody's biography where I wholly agreed with them. I remember reading the one by Gore Vidal, and on nearly every page.
Well, that's a novel.
I know. It was very novel.
Yeah.
And I remember making notes. In fact, when I was a kid in Los Angeles,
Yeah.
never dreaming I would grow into this stuff, I remembered reading Gore Vidal's editorials in the Herald Examiner about Lincoln and thinking, what? How could he say that about Abe Lincoln? Even taking umbrance with him then, and I didn't know anything, you know. So, nonetheless, some books I've made more notes in than others.
Mhm.
When Doris Kearns Goodwin's book came out, that was a book that I really had very few annotations in. I really enjoyed her work, and
So
but,
that's a compliment to it that you didn't notate it. You found it.
it's either a
both
compliment to her or to me. I'm not sure whom.
not full of things you disagreed with.
Right,
You meant.
right. Yeah, I think the worst one was Gore Vidal, but as far as my disagreeing,
Yes.
there weren't that many with
Well.
David Donald, and it really matters little. I mean, they're the one that published the book, not me.
But I would think it does matter, and this is a long subject too, and we'll go on to it further. But David Donald, for example, is said to not pay sufficient attention to Lincoln's religious life or religious views.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, as you say, he attributes certain things to Lincoln's fatalism, which comes from early in life, maybe. Okay, but audiences come to you with different expectations. They expect, some of them, that Lincoln's down on his knees praying sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And if they know anything about William Herndon, his law partner, who wrote about him as essentially an atheist,
Mm-hmm.
then they expect nothing of the kind.
Right.
And
Or if they read Thomas de Lorenzo, they expect a whole other
a
world
whole
of
different
things,
world, yes. And if they read Gore Vidal, they expect historical drama and verbal fist fights
Yeah, all
in
kinds of
every
things. Yeah,
sentence.
Yeah.
Well, that's why
And
I
you can have
asked
people
about
in the
these.
same audience who come from all of those perspectives.
Hmm.
It's an interesting
Well,
situation.
so
some
as you
days.
know, it's a challenge.
It is, yeah.
Well, what then is, let's not say the next challenge, because you probably have encountered most of them already. But what's been the biggest challenge in terms of an audience response that was either unexpected or just antithetical, unaccepting of what you are saying, what you are presenting?
I think one of the biggest challenges for me, and it probably says is more about me than anyone, is I was invited to portray Lincoln at a Juneteenth celebration.
Hmm.
And
Juneteenth couldn't
Is-
have been too long ago because it's a comparatively recent anniversary.
yes, but this was the longest continuous Juneteenth
Oh, it was.
celebration.
Okay.
It started, I think, in '66 or something, such
Oh, really?
1866. So
Oh,
it was a
yeah.
long-standing
Hmm.
affair. But I know there's more of them now than
More
there
of
used to be.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, I understood enough to know that this would not be the most friendly audience, and that the perception of Lincoln today in the black community is very different than it was in Lincoln's time, or even the 1880s, or even the 1920s. And you know, the Lincoln field, depending on when the work is published, reflects the worldviews of its day in many respects. And so, you know, we live in the age of the anti-hero, and then there's more racial tension now than there even was 5 years ago when I was there. And so all of those things went into the mix when I had to decide, what am I going to present? And so there's a work, and I can't think of the author, but it's called Lincoln's Citadel, and it's about Washington, D.C. And it, in that work, amongst many other things, describes some of the advances in civil rights that took place in Washington during the war, and what a cacophony of racial violence and awfulness there was when Lincoln arrived. What an enormous contrast in just 4.5 years later. And that was essentially what I presented to them, because I knew that's what they wanted to hear. Maybe that's too strong a word. I think what I perceived was they viewed Lincoln as not having done enough, which is not uncommon.
Right.
But I wanted to counteract that as much as I could, and set the program in a context that was historically accurate. I think he did an enormous amount in that time period, much to the surprise of all of his peers. So, but now looking back, we can say, oh well, he didn't take it near far enough, because we've gone a little farther, you know. So anyway, that was very difficult. Not only because I'm just not in tune enough with the black community, especially with, I mean, I could go to a black church and live in a black neighborhood and still not understand how they relate to Lincoln per se, because that's such a unique little niche, you know. And you go to almost any Lincoln event, you see very few black people, and so it's a little sliver of interest within the world of things that might catch their eye, you know.
That's funny.
So it was a very difficult, and I walked away from it, as I have many times, wondering, well, did that fly? Did that scour, as Lincoln is accused of saying?
That won't scour.
That won't scour. Yeah. But I tried, you know, and I used that program many times afterwards, more successfully in other settings. But I think they were much more interested in the man who was portraying Frederick Douglass, who's very good, and I think he could address the framework from which they were viewing things better than I could. I sounded too apologetic, I think.
Well,
and it's almost impossible not to.
I guess.
I approached it with that in mind almost.
No one ever asks Franklin Pierce to have done more, or James Buchanan to have done more. They expect that the person who did something ought to have done more faster. That's the oddity of it.
We live in the age of instant everything, you know.
You expect your heroes to have been more heroic quicker. And the forgotten ones are never called upon in history to have done something better. That's my limited understanding of the situation. At least Lincoln is so important to so many people, because we know that he fixed certain things, and we wish he'd fixed more of them, I guess. But never mind that. If Washington, D.C., in that example, Lincoln's Citadel, and I think that book is by Ken Winkle.
Oh yes, yeah.
very good writer.
Oh yeah, I met him one time, and I really like him, and I like his work.
Very good understanding of it.
He wrote The Young Eagle. That
The
was
Young
the first
Eagle
one of his
also,
books that I read.
yes. And he wrote an excellent short book about Abraham and Mary Lincoln,
Oh.
which is something we'll get onto in a bit.
Yeah,
But that setting, Washington, D.C., obviously key to Mr. Lincoln,
Yeah.
or its setting today, always key as our
Yeah.
capital.
Yeah.
And yet, maybe there's more or as much need today for Mr. Lincoln's presentations in St. Louis or Baltimore or Yale University. Have you been at places, have you done presentations where there had been a recent piece of social unrest or an angry debate that suddenly there's Lincoln to try to respond to?
Occasionally, and I was recently asked to speak at a Republican event, and currently the Republican Party is in disarray, for lack of a better word. I'm trying to think.
You mean recently? You mean during 2016 or 2015?
Yes, right. Currently,
Okay.
the situation with the coming election and the current political climate, the need for unity is something that Lincoln not only understood but mastered, and held famously a cabinet of team of rivals, as Goodwin put it, and a nation, and you know, he talked about doing all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. What does that mean? And so I've tried to address those things in situations where I understood for some reason that there was difficulty. But like on a Martin Luther King Day, I recently spoke on a Martin Luther King Day event, and that was in the St. Louis area, and on the heels of Ferguson, and so it wasn't well attended, but it was similar, you know, and so I spoke of those things. But you know, you may. There's an old saying: "The mind convinced against the will remaineth unconvinced still."
Say that again, please.
The mind convinced against the will remaineth unconvinced still. And that's a real thing when you go into a setting like that, especially when people expect you to be almost clownish anyway. They don't think I'm going to be serious, that I really have serious or grave or earnest intent. They expect me to be, okay, we got a Lincoln presenter, and once then we'll get on to the real business. I approach what I do very seriously, and so to sometimes convince them that I really believe what I'm saying takes the entire length of whatever time I'm given. And
you can't take 1 hour to change a lifetime or a half a lifetime's
and so there's a dynamic. You enter a really tense situation, and they've almost already set you aside just because of the garb and the nature of what I do. People aren't going to take me seriously anyway, and I understand that. I get around real politicians, and it's just a big guffaw when they realize there's a Lincoln guy there, you know. So I accept that. But so you go into a situation that's got some real grave concerns, and I try not to estimate too high, shoot too high. You know, in spite of what Lincoln said to Billy Herndon.
That's right. Don't shoot too high, Billy.
He told Billy, aim low. So sometimes I'm rolling the ball along the floor.
Well, let's conclude this first interview, this portion of our conversation, by asking you to go into character
Mhm.
as Mr. Lincoln
Mhm.
and speak a little bit as if you were addressing a high school or college audience today.
Mhm.
No particular social events, but everybody's aware of recent history, none
Mhm.
more so than
Mhm.
high schoolers who think it's all the most important thing that's ever happened because they learned it today.
Mhm. Mhm.
Could you tell us in Mr. Lincoln's words what you might say about either working on a farm or running the country? You choose.
One of the things I do with high schoolers, and I guess I can address the camera here, is I try to set the stage.
Yes.
And
please.
when I do that, I do it out of character, and then I give them the Lincoln vignette. But before I do the Springfield farewell, I will explain to them that Lincoln was looking at the possibility of the national demise. People thought this might be the end of the experiment in liberty, and that we had reached, even later said to Congress, is there possibly a fatal flaw in the American system? And so he was looking at some very grave and serious issues in terms of our national existence and our immediate future. The possibility of violence everywhere in the streets, right in your own neighborhoods. Now this gets the high schoolers thinking very seriously about current events. And then I tell them, and then he got to the station in a city of about 10,000, which had grown from about 1,000 in the years he lived here, to discover about 1,000 people when he expected almost no one. And he was overwhelmed. And he gave this very emotional speech, and Lincoln did not like his emotions to govern him, to be victimized by his own feelings, especially in a speech. But those who witnessed it said that his voice was choked with emotion, and at times he found it difficult to speak. And this is what he said. My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting to this place and the kindness of these people. I owe everything. Here, I've lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I might return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the aid of that divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that aid, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, I trust in your prayers you will commend me. I bid you an affectionate farewell. Of course, then the train left. And when Lincoln gave this, it was entirely impromptu. He didn't. It was a beautiful little speech, almost on the par with the Gettysburg Address, in my estimation. It was entirely off the cuff. So he got into the car and he and his secretary combined to write it down. For some reason, he couldn't go very far, either because he was still feeling the emotion, or he just needed to collect his thoughts, or maybe improve a little here or there. So you can still see that speech, the first part written in Lincoln's hand, and the second in his secretary's hand. And then I explained, the gravity of the railroad journey and all that was going on before I got to Washington. But it sets the stage, and then when I get emotional, well, they just get riveted, It doesn't take much sometimes to capture a high school audience, a little emotion, and it's so embarrassing. They don't want to look at anybody.
Well, the way the way you delivered that, Fritz, was wonderful, and it reminded me, with all the emotion in it, the hesitation, that it's very different from reading it as text in a book, which can be read calmly.
Yes.
I guess.
Yes.
There's no reason to assume that that's the way he did it.
Yeah, I try to include the fact that he was making it up as he went along. And occasionally he was at a loss for words, and then he thought of something. I mean, I know what I want to say, but I want it to look that way. The Gettysburg Address was carefully crafted, although perhaps fairly rapidly, but nonetheless Lincoln was a master at composing, and so but I do deliver it a bit differently, and I don't look like I'm searching for words. I don't wish to appear as though I'm searching for words.
Well, and the Gettysburg Address has applause interrupting at 3 or 4 junctures at least, which at least would give you time to think of the next sentence, perhaps. Whereas the farewell speech, as far as we know, was not interrupted by applause.
No.
Why would it be?
No. Yeah.
And so that is painful.
Yeah.
Do you
Although when I give it, sometimes mine is interrupted by the railroad trains going by.
That's true, if you're near a track. Do you give it any differently to an older audience, to grade schoolers, compared to what you've just shown us?
What I just gave, I will do for junior high and high school, but not for younger kids. Yeah. I may paraphrase a little of it for younger children.
You would never skip over the part about one of his children being buried here.
No.
And yet you don't want to rest
Although
on that thought in a grade school.
I have on 2 occasions gone to a grade school in which from which a child had recently died.
And you didn't know that?
No, they told me ahead of time in both cases. And they said, feelings are a little raw right now, so just so you know, be careful. If you talk about sad things, you might end up getting more tears than you and that's the reason, and so sometimes you get in a setting where you have to change what you were going to talk about.
So you did not give the farewell speech, the farewell address at those 2 schools?
In those schools, they were lower level, and at that stage in that program, at that stage of my career in that particular program, I talked about Lincoln's mother's death.
Oh.
I don't do that right now in a lower level program, but in that program I did. And that period I did. And so I skipped that. Because that's evocative.
Skipped his mother's death.
Yeah, I skipped that segment in there. Because that's very evocative for a child. I don't care who they are, they don't want mom to be gone. Even junior high kids, as coarse and with as much bravado as they have, mom is sacred still. And the loss of mom is tough. It's a tough thought,
Yeah.
And so I can kind of milk that, but I have to be careful. I don't want my child audience in tears.
No.
I want them thinking, not emoting.
Well, nothing makes history live better, but that isn't your role, perhaps.
Yeah, right.
Perhaps.
So
that is difficult. Let's spend our last few minutes, if you would, please, giving us a few more minutes of something in Mr. Lincoln's presidency. that is in character.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to suggest anything to you. I'll let you think about it for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
If, well, the context, let's say in this case, if it's an older audience,
Mm-hmm.
Whether a service group or a corporate lunch or what have you, that is, here in Springfield, something we too often forget. I'm guilty of it.
Mm-hmm.
That really what the world cares about, wants to know about, and the reason we remember Mr.
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln is his presidency,
Mm-hmm.
his leadership during
Mm-hmm.
our greatest trial,
Mm-hmm.
that fiery trial. But perhaps it's not always the best way to evoke his personality. You mentioned those 4 vignettes
Mm-hmm.
earlier.
Something that I use quite often with an adult audience, and I actually think it came, I'm having as often as I use it, I don't footnote my own speeches except on paper. Once they're
Mhm.
committed to memory, the footnotes sort of get blurry. But I think that this quote was from the period of the debates, but I couldn't tell you which one. But it goes like this, and this is a combination of things
Mhm.
from different sources, but I've never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I love the sentiments of those old-time men. This was their majestic interpretation of the economy of the universe, their lofty, wise, noble understanding of the justice of the Creator to his creatures, and to all of his creatures, to the whole great family of man. In their enlightened belief, nothing stamped with that divine image was sent into this world to be trodden on or brutalized. And you see, they grasped not just the race of men then living, they reached forward to seize upon the farthest posterity. They erected a beacon to guide their children and their children's children and the countless myriads who would inhabit this nation in future generations. Wise statesmen that they were, they knew the tendency of liberty to breed tyranny. And so they enshrined those immortal words in a public document, so that when in the future some man or some faction or some interest would set up their doctrine that none but the rich man or none but the white man were entitled to those same unalienable rights, that their posterity, my friends, you and I, could look up once again to the Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew the battle that our fathers began, so that truth and justice and mercy, all of the humane and Christian virtues would not be extinguished from this land, and no one would hereafter dare to limit or circumscribe the great principle upon which liberty is built. My friends, this nation is worth fighting for, to preserve so inestimable a jewel. That makes a good conclusion to a program.
An inestimable jewel.
Inestimable little jewel. If you can say that 5 times fast, you're doing well.
Then you can do a presentation. That's wonderful. Yeah, as you mentioned, it combines a few things.
Segments, yeah.
And in going back to the Declaration of Independence and those men of old times, you are giving a very broad American history lesson, little political philosophy, and then somewhere later in your presentation, perhaps you bring it up to more recent events, whether by allusion as Mr. Lincoln or directly as Mr. Klein. And so you are a history educator with a very few words.
And I try to never broach modern subjects while I'm in character.
No, no.
But I try to get as near to them as I can without doing so. In other words, I was thinking about working in the Lincoln home backyard this coming summer. And it's something that I've done many times in the past, but because of current concerns, it's going to ring somewhat differently. And what I say to folks is, so do you think that the coming election could mean war?
Well, Mr. Douglas,
That's exactly what they
Senator Douglas says no.
Well, see, and people will look at me in that
Senator
context,
Cruz, though,
and they're not sure if I'm talking about the 1860 election or the 2016 election, you know.
Right.
And sometimes they'll answer from one or the other context, you know, which is the fun of what I do.
It is.
But you just, I was once in the White House kitchen, and
the real White House kitchen.
No, and the here in Springfield.
The one in the museum.
In the museum, and folks would come in, and I would have standard things that I would say, like children. I would say, maybe there'd be an adult and a number of children, and I would know whether, usually if it's their own or a school group or something, but I would say, oh, are these orphans? And generally the woman or man, whoever was the caregiver would chuckle and say, no. and I would say, oh, there's so many right now all over Washington. Taddy likes, and I'll explain how Tad would get food for the children and so on, and that brings some gravity to it. Well, one time, and generally with young men of military age, I would say something along the line of, well, are you, have you signed up for the war? Meaning the Civil War. Well, one day I had said that to several young men, and some young men came walking in, and they were Middle Eastern. And I said that to them without thinking. And they looked at one another, and they were just speechless, because, and I don't remember which war was going on, but I think they thought I was talking about something modern. And it was very tense at the moment. And so there are times when, you know, my little play acting with folks can kind of backfire and create more problems than it solves. But
well, it's a reminder that history looks different every year.
It does. It does. Every president that I have lived through, every presidency that I have lived through, has colored to a certain extent what I do with Lincoln. People will ask me questions that relate to the current presidency, whoever is in office, and I have to reflect that in my answer in some way or another. And it's always interesting.
That is speaking as Mr. Lincoln.
As Mr. Lincoln.
You can manage to look forward a little bit without going out of character.
Yes. For instance, during a certain presidency, I would frequently be asked if I ever had rented my bedroom. And of course the allusion to it was to what was going on in the White House at the moment, you know. And so that kind of thing happens all the time. Current history affects the way people approach common history.